Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do another new video here based on one of your newer suggestions. This one having to do with what is by far one of the most unique encounters I have ever read. I mean, when I was reading this info, it just blew my mind when it comes to its originality, its fascinating beings that were encountered here. And when I relay this information, I hope that you think the same thing too. I mean, when I was reading this is just like straight out of science fiction when it comes to this particular encounter. I've never heard of anything like this before. Maybe you have or haven't either, but it has to do with this. It's known as the Prospect Monoliths Encounter, something that occurred a couple of decades back. So it's going to be a little bit short in terms of information, but at least here is all the good info associated with this amazing, absolutely amazing encounter. So what was this Prospect Monoliths Encounter? Well, you have to go back just a little ways, in this case to January 27th, 1977 to be specific, there at a place called Prospect, Kentucky, hence the name of the Prospect Monoliths. And it has to do with a young man at the time, 19 years old, by the name of Lee Parrish. According to what I was reading on several sites, he was driving home at night, I think from work, it seemed like, and the idea was from his work destination up to wherever he was going home would normally take about 15 minutes. This is very important because it'll come into play in just a little bit. So he was driving home at 1 in the morning that night when suddenly he spotted what he described as a rectangular object hovering in the sky. It made me wonder, rectangular object, was it monolithic? Did it look something along those lines like 2001? More on that in just a little bit too. So there he was seeing this strange object. Obviously it stood out completely in its isolated nature, him being just right there by himself in that road, and then seeing this thing hovering around him. It seemed like he had some kind of radio that was playing at that very same time. Maybe he was driving home listening to music, because suddenly it began failing, and his vehicle, he no longer was able to have or take control of it. Maybe it was slowing down, maybe it was shutting off, flickering on and off. The details weren't exactly there, but whatever was happening, he no longer had control of it. And then that was it, like almost like in an instant things turned to black, and then things came back up, like he woke up in one single flash. Like when I was reading this, I imagined like a movie scene, how all of a sudden things just quickly fade to black, and then with half a second later you're back in a different complete environment. Well, there he was in this case, arriving home, and he realized all of a sudden that he felt kind of sore. He looked at his eyes, found that he was completely bloodshot, but the most important thing was this. He realized that there was more than a half hour of time gone from the time period that he saw this thing. Again, this trip should have taken 15 minutes at most. Remember, I was mentioning that earlier, but in this case, there he was at home, but with 30 hours of missing time. This is a telltale sign again when it comes to alien encounters. How many times have we read about that? Whenever people realized all of a sudden that they have this missing time. Just a brief little sideway on that too. I've actually met someone there in Las Vegas who told me that she also had some missing time period as well. Not necessarily with in this case, aliens or UFOs, but more along the lines of paranormal stuff. So I have, in this case, been around someone who has actually had that happen to them. So just a little segue on that part. So he wanted to find out, in this case, this Lee Parrish, what happened. Obviously something happened. He didn't remember what it was. All he remembered was driving home, seeing that thing in the sky, and then the next instant missing that half hour and then being at home. So he actually took a hypnosis. I don't know though. Someone please post it on the comments below. Did he volunteer for this hypnosis, or was this something where somebody suggested it to him? Who knows? I was trying to see if I could find more info on it, but it seems to be pretty vague. Either way, though, he went under this hypnosis, and that's where things came into play. So We have heard that before as well, right? With other past alien encounters where people don't have recollection of things unless they're driven under hypnosis. And here's where things get really weird. This is why I love this story, because this is by far one of the most unique, fascinating, interesting, just wildly original, in this case, encounters yet. So, once under hypnosis, he fully described what happened. All of a sudden, he stated that since seeing that monolithic thing, that rectangular object in the sky, he was suddenly transported into this huge round room. I could just imagine it where it's just completely spacious, cavernous, just gigantic. Just a huge round room, probably lots of dark spots surrounding it, except for maybe a light in the center where he is. But there he was in this round room, and he saw these things. You're looking at them now. He described them as being some of the strangest creatures pretty much out there, and even possibly machines. That's why this thing takes a whole other turn, as I was mentioning earlier, because these things could not actually be, in this case, aliens, but actually machines or machine type aliens. Who knows? But here's how he described them. Three of them were right there in front of him. One of them was the biggest one. It was a figure that was just towering the rest, at least 20 feet tall. That's really tall. And then also it resembled like a rough black tombstone, just completely smooth, black, and then just towering over everything. The only thing that stood out was there was this one single pointed arm that seemed to bend almost like an arm would at the elbow, and it was facing forward towards him. Maybe it was something along the lines of an inspecting arm, something like that. The second creature, or the second machine there, was 6 feet tall, so not quite as tall, but still tall enough, especially when you consider that all these other encounters with aliens or greys tend to have smaller humanoids. In this case, no, this thing was 6 feet tall, and it was described as being pure white. It also had like a weird unmoving like facade to it. In other words, it had these arms, but these arms looked like they were completely stationary, like they just sat there right at its side. So just amazing when I was reading this info, just thinking, how these things looked. And it also had this head, if you could describe it like, but no discernible features, like no eyes, no ears, no mouths, nothing. Not even like with your average gray having those features. No, in this case, this thing just had what was described as a wedge-like head on top of its fat little body, and with those unmovable arms. And then the third creature was this being that had like this, I guess, reddish rectangular look to it. It was the smallest of the bunch, and it seemed to have the most components to it, if you could call it that. But this creature was just standing there on the side. Very interesting, though, with regards to that, because it seemed like that creature seemed to have emotion, if you could describe it that. It seemed to be the most afraid out of the other two. And then also tying into that emotion stuff, or emotional stuff, the white being, the one that was 6 feet tall, seemed to be the leader. Like it emanated its presence or its stature or its movements or whatever it was. It just seemed to denote that it was the leader of the group. And then maybe the tallest one, the biggest one, might have been more along the lines of an enforcer, like somebody that was making sure that things didn't get out of hand. Either way, though, at this brief encounter, he was able to see all of this, capture all of this, just within those few moments. It didn't last long because, unfortunately for him, this reddish creature, remember the smallest one, the one with the most components, approached him. And then whatever it was using in terms of its arm, it touched him. He felt what he described again under hypnosis as a cold, stinging sensation, and then it felt like he was being analyzed, and then that was it. That there was not much else that happened afterward. This analyzation was done. All he saw after that was this red being seemed to actually disappear behind the white being. So not through him or not into him, but more along the lines of disappeared behind them, almost like sneaking behind them. And then the white being went behind the black being, all at almost like in a smooth motion. That's the way that I read it, at least. And then finally, the large black being just moved backwards, and then it began to disappear into the dark background. And then that was it. The next thing he knew, he was back at his Jeep driving home thereafter. So that could have essentially accounted for the missing 30 minutes. But isn't that crazy? This is one of the most unique encounters yet. These machines, or whatever they were, machine-like aliens, with these three beings that he had, like this unique encounter with them. Remember I was mentioning earlier about like 2001, because it totally reminded me of that infamous scene towards the end when the main character just travels throughout space and time and then seems to encounter these brilliant lights, whatever they were, which I've read. Is that right? Are they supposed to be like a representation of some of the most advanced machines just far, far out there, just so far that we can't even conceive them, but they're still supposed to be some kind of machine? So could this be something along those lines, where instead of aliens, he had a unique encounter with some very advanced, very sentient machine-like beings? If so, then that definitely puts this into one of the most original, one of the most bizarre just encounters yet. But nothing else really that happened afterward with this guy Lee Parrish. It seemed like this was the only time he had that very specific encounter. No one else seemed to have that as well there in Prospect, Kentucky. And ever since then, I guess nowhere else either within other parts of the world. Because again, with this unique, a specific time, no one. I mean, I haven't read of any other type of monolithic or other type of creatures similar to this throughout other parts of the world. But what do you guys think? Doesn't this one stand out in all the other stories that I mentioned that seem to just like almost repeat each other when it comes to visiting the Greys coming over, people seeing their standard classic UFO, that kind of stuff? No, in this case here you have several factors that just completely just stood out. But if anybody has anything else I might have missed, please post those comments below. That'd be really great to hear. Anybody from there, Prospect, Kentucky, maybe it might have more information. That'd be really good to hear. This again happened in 1977, so he was 19 years old at the time. He should still be alive now, unless of course something else has happened. So it'd be interesting to see if he ever has any updates, this guy Lee Parrish, with what occurred to him. But that's pretty much it. That's all the info associated with this video. So, all right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.